So in the previous lecture, we covered how to calculate marginal utility divided by the price so that way we are able to know how much utility per dollar spent we are going to obtain when we consume some good or service. And then we were able to compare that to the marginal utility per dollar spent for other goods to ultimately determine what goods and services we purchase with our limited income. And then we also learned that if we purchase goods and services in this manner, that it would push us towards what we call our consumer equilibrium, meaning there's no other way we could have allocated our limited income to derive more utility from our purchases. Now, just because we reach a consumer equilibrium does not mean that we stay there. In other words, what happens if a good that we normally purchase experiences a price change? If it experiences a price change, then that means the marginal utility per dollar spent on the last unit of each good will no longer be equal, which is why we will no longer be in consumer equilibrium. So anytime goods experience price changes, it causes us to reallocate the way we spend our limited income so that we can now reach our new consumer equilibrium. So sticking with the same example that we had in the previous lecture, you recall that we had a $10 budget and there were 3 beverages that you were deciding between: milk, soda, and beer. And we ultimately decided that we would have purchased 3 sodas, 2 milks, and 1 beer with our $10 budget. However, let's say that one of those goods experiences a price change. Let's say this time when we have our $10 budget, this week the milk is on sale. It's no longer $2 a carton, it's now $1 a carton. Again, notice now it completely changes the marginal utility per dollar spent because the good experienced a price change. Because the price is now lower, in other words, we can buy the good at a lower price, we are going to derive more utility per dollar spent from the purchase of the milk than what we did previously when the price was $2. In other words, before, when the price was $2, notice for the first carton of milk, we would have only derived 100 utils per dollar spent on that item. However, now that that item is on sale, we'll derive 200 utils from that first unit of milk. So again, every time a good experiences a price change, that causes us to alter the goods and services that we ultimately purchase. So again, recall in our previous example, we were looking at the data as a whole in this slide right here. And this was when the price of milk was $2. And so again, we saw that our first purchase would have been a soda, our second purchase would have been a soda, and we wouldn't have switched to purchasing milk until our third purchase. However, now that milk is cheaper, we're no longer going to look at this data for milk. We're now going to look at this data for milk. And more specifically, we're looking at the marginal utility per dollar spent on milk. So this column right here. So now again, we see that our first purchase, we're actually indifferent between purchasing a soda or a milk. In other words, the first soda would give us 200 utils per dollar spent, and the first milk also gives us 200 utils per dollar spent. So the first purchase would either be the milk or the soda, and then the second purchase would be the milk or the soda, depending on what we bought first. So again, you'll notice that the order in which we purchase goods, or the combination of goods that we purchase, is now going to change simply because the utility, the price changed of the milk, which changes the utility per dollar spent on milk. All right, so here on this slide, I'm going to walk you through an example of how we would alter our purchases when a good experiences a price change. So let's say that I'm just deciding to buy 2 different items. I'm deciding whether I want to buy apples or oranges. And let's say that the marginal utility I would get from the first apple would be 15 utils, and the amount I would get from the second apple is 10 utils. And then the marginal utility of the first orange, let's say I get 10 utils, and the marginal utility from the second orange, I would get 5. So clearly we can see that when I'm not considering price, if the items were free, I would be consuming the apples over the oranges because I have a slight preference for them. However, we know that because I have to purchase them, I have to take the price into consideration. So let's say currently that the price of apples and oranges are both $1. So again, you'll notice that I have that listed here, marginal utility divided by the price when the price is $1. And then the same thing over here, marginal utility divided by the price when the price is $1. So of course, if the price is just $1, our denominator's 1, so we're doing 15 divided by 1, which is 15, and 10 divided by 1, which is 10. And then we do the same thing over here, 10 divided by 1 is 10, 5 divided by 1 is 5. So we have the marginal utility per dollar spent. Well, clearly we see that my first purchase is going to be an apple because that first apple brings me more utility than that first orange. And then my second purchase would be either an apple or an orange, because notice that the first orange will give me 10 utils and the second apple will also give me 10 utils. So I'm basically indifferent between the two. However, let's say that apples experience a price increase. Let's say the price of apples goes up to $2 now. Well, now when we do the math, 15 divided by 2, we come up with 7.5 utils per dollar spent on apples, and 10 divided by 2 for that second apple, we'd only get 5 utils per dollar spent on apples. So now, because the apples have experienced a price change, if I was going to purchase apples or oranges, I would actually purchase an orange instead this time, because that first orange would give me more utility per dollar spent than purchasing that first apple. So again, this clearly illustrates how when goods and services experience price changes, it alters our consumer equilibrium because it alters the utility we're going to get per dollar spent. Therefore, we are going to alter what we purchase. And again, if you think about yourself in the real world, how you spend your money, you probably identify that you don't spend your income the same exact way every single week, that you alter the goods and services that you purchase. And one of the main reasons that you alter what you purchase is because the prices of goods and services change. Therefore, because you always want to get the most amount of satisfaction possible from your purchases, you're going to alter your purchases in a manner where you're maximizing the utility per dollar spent. The next concept that I want to cover is something called a consumer surplus. So I want you to understand what a consumer surplus is and how you calculate it. Basically, a consumer surplus is just the difference between what a consumer is willing and able to pay for a good and the price that the consumer actually has to pay. Because again, based on our demand curve, we're willing and able to pay different prices for each individual unit that we would purchase. So for example, let's say that we connect dots A, B, and C over here on this graph. In other words, let's say that that is my demand curve for this particular good. So the particular good we have on here is UCDs. Notice that when the price is $3, I'm willing to only buy one CD. When the price drops to $2, I'm willing to buy 2 CDs. And when the price drops to $1, I'm now willing to buy 3 CDs. And now if I want to know what the consumer surplus is, I just need to know what the current prevailing market price is for CDs, for UCDs. So let's say that the current market price, like I have here on the slide, for UCDs is $1. So if I go into the store and buy UCDs, I'm only going to pay $1. Well, for the first CD, I would have been willing to pay $3 based on my demand curve. However, I didn't pay $3. I paid the market price of $1. Therefore, the difference between 3 and 1 is 2. I got a consumer surplus of 2 for that first CD. For the second CD I would have purchased, based on my demand curve, I would have been willing to pay $2. But again, I only had to pay 1 because that was the market price. Therefore, I had a market surplus of $1 for the second CD. And then for the third CD, I would have been willing to pay $1, and I did pay $1. Therefore, my consumer surplus was 0. So my total consumer surplus when the market price of a UCD is $1 is 2 plus 1 plus 0, which is $3. So again, depending on the price of the good, good, that's what dictates what the value of your consumer surplus is going to be. And again, it's simply the difference between what you would have paid for each individual unit of that good and what you actually paid. So let's say that this is your current demand curve for beer, and I ask you to calculate what your consumer surplus for beer is going to be when the market price of a beer is $3. So the first thing you identify is, well, when the price is $3, how many beers am I going to purchase? So based on this demand curve, we see that you would be right here. In other words, you would have ultimately purchased 3 beers. So again, we need to see what would you have been willing to pay for each one of those 3 beers, and what did you actually pay. So if the market price is $3, then 3 times 3 means that you're ultimately paying $9 for those 3 beers. But again, if we want to calculate the consumer surplus, we have to figure out how much you would have paid for each individual beer. So based on your demand curve, for that first beer, you would have been willing to pay $5. In other words, because notice that at a quantity of 1, you're at point up here at 5. So again, for that first beer, you would have been willing to pay $5. However, you only paid 3. Therefore, for that first beer, you had a consumer surplus of 2. For that second beer, you would have been willing to pay $4, but again, you only paid 3. Therefore, if that second beer, you added another $1 to your consumer surplus. And then, of course, that third beer, you would have been willing to pay $3, and you did pay $3, so you added nothing more to your consumer surplus. So the total value of your consumer surplus would have been $3. Another way that you could calculate it is just add up the amount that you would have paid for each beer. So you would have paid $5, you would have paid $4, and you would have paid $3 for those 3 beers. Therefore, you would have been willing to pay $12. And then you compare that to what you actually paid, which was $9 up here. So then again, you would just do the $12 minus the $9, and you notice you come up with the same number of 3. So again, either way, you're going to come up with the correct answer and how to calculate the consumer surplus. Now let's say that it's happy hour, and now the price of a beer drops from $3 to $2. And I want you to tell me now, what is your consumer surplus? In other words, how is your consumer surplus altered when a good experiences a price change? So again, now we see at a price of $2, you would have actually purchased 4 beers. You're down here along the demand curve. So in other words, $2 a beer times 4, you would have ultimately spent $8 on your beer, but we want to know how much would you have spent for each individual beer. So again, for the first beer, based on your demand curve, you would have paid $5. The second beer, you would have paid $4. The third beer, you would have paid $3. And then for that fourth beer, you would have paid $2. So again, you're just finding the point that corresponds along your demand curve. So 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2, you see that you would have been willing to pay $14 for those 4 beers. However, you only had to pay 8, so 14 minus 8, you have a consumer surplus of $6. So notice that when the price of a good decreases, your consumer surplus increases, and vice versa. When the price of a good goes up, so again, if the price goes back up to $3, then your consumer surplus decreases. And of course, we know that's because of the slope of the demand curve. Now, in that example of where I was illustrating, the price of beer changing and that altering our consumer surplus, it also altered the amount of money that we were spending on beer. In other words, initially we spent $9 on 3 beers, then we spent $8 on 4 beers. So it's important to understand that every single time a good experiences a price change, we have 2 different effects taking place. We have what's called the substitution effect of a price change, and we have what's called an income effect of a price change. So basically, the substitution effect just tells us that as the price of a good goes down, the consumer will now purchase more of that less expensive good and less of other goods. So we learned about the substitution effect back in chapter 3. In other words, as a good gets cheaper, we will now substitute the purchase of the less expensive good. So in other words, when we move from 3 to $2 on this current demand curve. Notice that at $3, we would have purchased one CD and spent a total of $3. And if the price drops to $2, we're now going to buy two UCDs, but we're actually spending $4. So we're actually allocating more of our money to the purchase of this less expensive good now. In other words, before we were only spending $3 on UCDs, now we're spending $4. So again, that's always going to take place whenever goods experience price changes. Generally, we will substitute the purchase of the less expensive good because of the downward slope of our demand curves. We know that as the price of goods go down, the quantity demanded is going to increase. Now, the second thing that happens is there's actually an income effect of a price change. The income effect basically illustrates that a consumer's income can buy more of all goods when the price of one good decreases, everything else held constant. And then, of course, it could go the opposite way. If you have to pay more for goods and services, then that means it's as if your income has decreased and you have to buy less of all goods and services. So in other words, let's say that the price continued to go down for this good. In other words, it was starting at $2 for UCDs, and then it goes down to $1. So again, when the price is $2, we're spending $4 total on UCDs, but when the price drops down to $1, we're only spending $3 total on UCDs. So it's as if our income has increased. In other words, even though we have the same exact income, because we're paying less now for the UCDs, we have an extra dollar in our pocket that we can go ahead and spend on something else. So every single time goods experience price changes, we experience both the substitution effect and the income effect. In other words, when prices go down, we will substitute the purchase of the less expensive good, and it's as if our income has increased. And then, of course, if the price of a good goes up, we're going to substitute the purchase of another good that's less expensive, and it's as if our income has decreased. Now, the last component covered in this particular chapter is behavioral and neuroeconomics. So I'm just going to briefly cover both, but the textbook actually does a really good job of breaking down these topics. So make sure that you read this chapter thoroughly because I'm just going to give you a brief summary. But basically, sometimes when we observe human behavior, it does not appear to be rational under the model of consumer choice. In other words, in Lecture 1 and Lecture 2, I went through extensively how we understand the logic of consumer choice, and we used a very, very tedious procedure, right? In other words, we said every good gives you a certain amount of marginal utility, then you have to divide that marginal utility by the price of that good, and then you have to compare the marginal utility per dollar spent to all of the other goods, and then that's what ultimately makes you purchase what you do. But sometimes we observe people making choices that does not appear rational based on this theory. So why is that? If we as economists believe that people always behave in a manner that is inherent to their rational self-interest, then why do they make decisions that appear irrational to other people? The first thing I would like to point out is that even though it may appear irrational to other people, the idea is that it's rational to that person at the time that they are making that choice. So economists are trying to understand, well, why is it that it's rational to them at the time they make the choice? One of the biggest theories that economists have come up with to understand this behavior is simply that the average human maintains overconfidence. We believe we are better at activities than we actually are, which is why you see us making decisions on a consistent basis based on the way we perceive ourselves, not for who we actually are. So it's just this fact that we as humans are overconfident that causes us to make decisions that appear irrational to other people. So a good example would be something like if we're talking about how the average person views people as drivers. If you ask somebody how many people on the road are actually good drivers, then they might say only 50% of drivers are actually good drivers on the road. However, if you ask that same person, do you think that you're a good driver? Well, 9 times out of 10, people are going to say, oh yes, I'm a good driver, but it's just everybody else who's a bad driver. So in other words, this clearly illustrates the fact that people don't have a true reflection or accurate depiction of their driving abilities, because if half of the people on the road are bad drivers but 90% of people think they're good drivers, then there's clearly some overconfidence going on in people's driving ability. Another theory that economists have come up with is just mental accounting. In other words, how we view that income that we spend. Notice that in the examples that I went through in the previous lecture, I never once asked you where your income came from. In other words, I gave you a $10 budget. I told you to calculate the marginal utility per dollar spent, and then that's what's going to dictate what you ultimately purchase. But I never said, well, where did that $10 come from? And what economists have figured out is that the source of the income actually may alter how we spend that money. So maybe money that I work really hard for, like a paycheck, I'm going to spend one way, but money that I inherit or maybe win in the lottery, I'm going to spend a different way. And that's something that our theory does not take into account. So in other words, we have to, think about how people spend different sources of income differently. The mental accounting that goes on in our head is going to be different for income from one source versus another. The third thing that economists have figured out is just that the way that firms frame the price of a good actually can cause people to alter what they purchase. So for example, if I went to the mall and I was shopping and I saw a pair of jeans priced at $50 and that was just the price on the price tag, I may not be willing to purchase it. However, if the price tag says $200 and then there's a sale price on top of that rack saying 75% off, so again, I think I'm saving $150 by buying these jeans for $50 now, then that may alter my decision to buy those jeans. In other words, simply the way the firm framed the price alters my decision to purchase the good. Another thing that economists have figured out is that people generally like to just stick with the status quo, and they like to make choices that they're familiar with, which again could help us understand, while even when consumers are faced with options that may make them better off, because we tend to like to stay in our comfort zone, we may still make the same decisions rather than making a decision that makes us better off, because we're just more comfortable sticking with the status quo and making the choices that we're most familiar with. Now, the very last thing covered in the textbook is neuroeconomics. And so neuroeconomists basically use medical techniques for measuring how brain activity is when we are making choices. And so this is really, really interesting. And it is a new emerging field of economics. So you'll notice that in the textbook, there's not a whole lot of information about neuroeconomics, but I find it very interesting to see what is going on in our brain activity when we are making choices. So again, something like you might think, well, it's very irrational for somebody to, do cocaine. However, when neuroeconomists scan the brains of somebody who's a drug addict, they actually see the same parts of the brain light up for just as somebody who's maybe a shopping addict or somebody that is a food addict. In other words, it doesn't seem to appear that what the actual addiction is has any difference in terms of its impact on the brain. So the more we can understand how our choices impact the brain patterns, the more likely we are to understand, why people make the choices that they do and why they appear rational to that person at the time they're making the choice.